So we talked about this yesterday, right? I think you guys had as much fun watching the show yesterday as I did doing it. It was just a really fun show, talking about the rankings because we put a lot of thought into it. We put a lot of thought into rankings. Like I go through all the schedules. I'm going to have my conference predictions coming out here over the next week or so, where I actually literally go through and predict every game, so that way I can have records for everybody. And so we do put thought into it, but it's meant to be fun, right? We know that we're not going to get them all right. We're going to get some right. We're going to get some wrong. I always like to point out how I got it right that I had LSU in the college football playoff in 2019, but I think I also had Notre Dame, and obviously I was wrong on that one. I had Washington last year, but I think I also had Georgia on there last year, so those are things that we're going to get some right. We're going to get some wrong. It's meant to be fun. And the reason it was even more fun this year is because as we're kind of going through it, you're just like, Vince and I were talking like, dude, I really like this matchup for Notre Dame against this team and that team, where in past years it'd be like, well, it was a good run. It's going to end right here. And that's something to be excited about because there is a raised bar for Notre Dame right now, in my opinion. There certainly is in my eyes, but I think it's also nationally. I think there's a national change. There's a shift in perception with Notre Dame. And when you look at where this team is, I think part of it is because of the unknown of Marcus Freeman. And there's this perception that like Notre Dame is more talented than they've been in past years, which I think is true. That's why we see the 5 preseason All-Americans. I saw something yesterday on Twitter, and it was like picking coaches based on like who's the best, recruiter, who's the best at offense, who's the best at defense, who's the best whatever. And they had Brian Kelly as the most consistent, and they also had Brian Kelly as the choker. Now, I don't know that that's fair to say about Brian Kelly. We've talked about that, to call him a choker. I don't know that there was a lot of big games that Brian Kelly lost where he was the significantly better team and they choked it away. I don't think that's a fair assessment, but to say he doesn't win big games is a very fair assessment. But I think the reason that's relevant to this is because how you perceive the head coach is going to be how you perceive a program. And for a long time, right or wrong, fair or not, Notre Dame was capped under Brian Kelly. That was the perception. They were only going to take you so far. Well, the perception of Marcus Freeman is they're adding more talent than they have in the past, not just in high school, but also in the portal. And when you look at this Notre Dame football team, there's some portal players that people are very fired up about nationally, not just in the Notre Dame world, but nationally. And it's funny, I get a lot of Notre Dame people that are they'll much poo-poo kind of Chris Mitchell, for example. Even had somebody in the chat yesterday thought that I'd kind of dismissed Chris Mitchell, but you get, I got to see it. But every time I talk to someone who's not affiliated with Notre Dame and you bring up Chris Mitchell, they're very high on him. I talked about this. I was on with Cole Kubelic the other day from ESPN. I was on his podcast, and I brought up Chris Mitchell. And he talked about how he'd seen Chris Mitchell in person doing a game. He's down in the field, and how high he was on him. And obviously there's a lot of people excited about Bo Collins, and Jaden Harrison's a preseason second-team All-American kick returner. Riley Leonard, R.J. Open, Rod Hurd are all guys. Jordan Clark are all guys that people are very excited about. So there's this perception that the talent has been raised. And so you look at this football team, and it's fun to talk about, but it also means there's higher expectations. And when you look at this Notre Dame football team, you have to ask yourself, what's the ceiling? Not, okay, big picture for Notre Dame just in general is championships, right? That's the standard at Notre Dame. Win a championship, compete for championship. And it is the standard, and it should always be the standard in regard to what's the ultimate goal. But not every team is a championship team. Not every Knute Rockne team was a championship. Knute Rockne was a coach for 10 years, 10 or 11 years, at least 10, over 10 years, and only won, I think, 2 titles. Frank Leahy was a head coach for a decade. He won 4 titles. Or Parseja was a head coach for over, I think, 11 seasons, and he only won 2 titles. Lou Holtz was a head coach from 1986 to 1996, I believe, and he only won 1 title. So a lot of those great coaches that are legends that have statues that built Notre Dame, they didn't win a championship every year. But what is your ceiling as a program? What can you be if you maximize your potential? And this Notre Dame team, in my view, is one that I believe their ceiling is that of a title contender. That doesn't mean they're going to win it. I don't know if they're going to win it. I can't read minds, and I can't see into the future. Wish I could. That would be a little scary, but also pretty cool. But that's how I feel like this team has a lot of things in place that you look at and say, if they maximize their potential, they can go toe to toe with anybody. Now, there's some other teams that can go toe to toe with Notre Dame if they play to their best. And that's what makes the postseason so fun. But this is a team that has the tools to make a deep run in the college football playoff. And by deep run, I mean winning at least 2 games. That's the sort of, it's not the ultimate ceiling, but it's the ceiling for, if they reach their full potential, they at least get here. Then after that, it depends on matchups and different things. And so that's kind of where I see this team. And so what I want to do with these next 2 segments is talk about reasons that I'm excited or optimistic that this team can reach that potential right there, that they can contend for a title. And then segment 2, part 2 will be, with that being the standard, what are 5 potentially stumbling blocks that could keep Notre Dame from getting there? But we're going to start with the positive. And we're going to start with the things that to me are the 5 areas that I look at this football team and say, it's because of this that this team has a chance to make a deeper run and go toe-to-toe with the best teams in ways where past Notre Dame teams could not. Reason number 1, and this is really what it comes, is it starts with me, the way that I think. I played and I coached the game. I always think about it from top down, coaching on down. And while we still have a lot of things we need to learn about Marcus Freeman as a head coach, he's only been head coach for 2 seasons. This is going to be year 3 for him. He's now hired 2 coordinators that are far more established, that have much longer track records. And you look at the offensive coordinator hire this offseason of Mike Denbrock. You now pair him with Al Golden, who built one of the best defenses in college football last season. We hope that he can continue that here in year 3. And you are now putting Notre Dame in the conversation of who has the best coordinator combo in college football. I don't think it's a no-brainer that Notre Dame is that pick, just like I don't think it's a no-brainer that Ohio State is that pick. There's 4 or 5 schools, we've talked about them in the past, that to me are in the conversation for best coordinators, not head coach that calls plays, coordinators in college football. And it's been a long time since Notre Dame has had that. And honestly, I don't know that I've been alive in an era where Notre Dame had that, because in a lot of years you had situations where, Lou Holtz was the play caller for Notre Dame on one side of the ball, sometimes 2. So, I mean, I'm too young to remember this, but like 1988, right? So we'll have to kind of go back to that conversation. But when I look at this Notre Dame team, there's no doubt that this group, this duo of Mike Denbrock and Al Golden, have an opportunity to become one of the best tandems in college football. And that's something that certainly gives them a great starting point, because let's be honest, there have been a lot of years where Notre Dame had a lot of talent on the roster, talent in certain coaching spots to say, you know what, this team can go toe-to-toe with a lot of people. I think the 2015 team was that way. That might be the most talented Notre Dame team we've seen since Lou Holtz was head coach. It's in the conversation. You look at that team and the quarterback depth and talent they had there, running back depth of talent. You had Will Fuller at receiver, and the other 2 starters were sub 4 or 5 guys. You had an offensive line that had 4 first or second round draft picks on it, and a 5th guy that would have been drafted had he not retired from football to go pursue another career. Your entire starting defensive line got played in the NFL. The only guy that didn't get drafted, Romeo Okwara, probably had the best career of all of them. You had Jalen Smith, who's one of the most special linebackers we've ever seen at Notre Dame. You had Kavari Russell, who was a high draft pick, a cornerback. Cole Luke, a cornerback on that 2015 team. Max Redfield, Elijah Shoemate. Matthias Farley started 2 years from the Indianapolis Colts. He didn't start in that 2015 Notre Dame defense, and he was a veteran. So there's been years where they had that talent. That 2015 team had Mike Denbrock at OC. You had Harry Heastan on offensive line. So there were some pieces in place for that team to be dynamic. But what was the concern going into that year? I said it then. I say it now. The stumbling block for that team was going to be your strength coach and your coordinators, your defensive coordinator. Strength coach, I don't know about with this team. Well, I don't know a lot about Lauren Lando, and we're going to all find out together. But in 2015, you knew for a fact that they were going to have a problem. You were going to have to overcome your coordinator. And if you're trying to overcome your coordinator, your chances of competing for a championship are not great. Not great. Like, let's just say hypothetically, let's assume this happens. Let's assume that in 2015, that Notre Dame goes to the college football playoff. Let's just say hypothetically that they would have somehow found a way to win to knock off Clemson at the end of that game in 2015. And Torrey Hunter, scores that last touchdown. They call a little something different in the college in that last 2-point conversion play. That game goes a little differently at the end. Okay, let's just say that happens. And Notre Dame goes into Stanford, ranked number 2, whatever their ranking would have been, and they beat Stanford. They don't give up that last field goal at the end of the game. Let's just say hypothetically that was the case. Notre Dame's number 1 seed that season, maybe number 2. What was Bama's record that year? Do you guys remember? Was Bama undefeated going into No, Bama, that was not an undefeated Bama team. They lost to Ole Miss. So Notre Dame would have been the 1 seed. What is your confidence level that Notre Dame, A, would have been able to beat Oklahoma in the first round with Baker Mayfield at quarterback, and then beat Alabama in round 2 with Derrick Henry at running back with Brian Van Gorder as your defensive coordinator? A guy who had literally the worst 3-year stretch of run defense in Notre Dame history. What are the odds of that happening? I don't feel good about that. I know you all don't feel good about that because you had a stumbling block that was at your coordinator level. There were other years where you felt good about the defensive side of the ball, but you didn't feel good about the offensive side of the ball, right? It's been this back and forth. And this is probably the most confident I've been in Notre Dame's coordinators since 2018. And going into 2019, when you had Chip Long, who I thought did a great job in 2017 at Notre Dame. You had Clark Lee replacing Mike Elko. I said back then I felt that was a good hire. But the difference now is, even though I feel way better about this group than I did that. That was the last year I went into a season thinking that you felt really good about both coordinators going into the season, with Clark Lee going in his first year as coordinator, but he'd been the linebackers coach under Mike Elko the year before. I thought he was going to keep going what Coach Elko had established, and he did. And then, of course, Chip Long built on his success from 2017. Felt great about that team going into 2018 from a coordinator standpoint. And what happened? That team went 12-0, made it to the college football playoff, beat Michigan in a huge game at the start of the season, handled their business against everybody else. You beat a top 15 Syracuse team by 33 on a neutral field in November. You beat a ranked Northwestern team on the road. You did what you needed to do with that football team in 2017 or 2015. No, I'm sorry. Yeah, no. 2018, excuse me, 2018. And I'm even more confident in the coordinators here because it's more established on both sides of the ball. With Chip Long, he had done some good things at Memphis and had a really good year in 2017, but it was still kind of, okay, I like him. He's going to do a good job, but how good is he going to do? And then with Clark Lee, I thought, I said at the time, if you got the chops, you got the chops. And I thought he had the chops, and he proved that as a coordinator, he had the chops. Did he ever have a defense as dominant as the one Al Golden had last year? Nope. And so I look at these coordinators, and I'm very, very optimistic that Notre Dame is going to be able to go into every game they play this year and say, from a game planning standpoint, a play calling standpoint, overall and in big moments, they finally have a coaching staff in place on both sides of the ball that give you a chance to win games. Well, let me rephrase it. You're not going to lose games, in my opinion, because you're not coached well enough or don't have enough experience or talent at that position. I think Notre Dame's going to be able to go toe-to-toe with the best when it comes to a coaching standpoint this season, and that has often not been the case at Notre Dame in the past when you look at it from the coordinators on both sides of the ball. Reason number 2, talent. And there's really 2 ways of looking at this. I did a show earlier this summer where I talked about, to be a great team, I believe you need stars. There aren't a lot of teams that have won at an elite level without stars. You could somewhat argue last year that Michigan didn't have any stars. I would push back on that. I do think Michigan had some stars on their team last year. They had some first-team All-American type players, first-round draft pick type players, and that's probably the closest that we've seen. But you really need those impact, high-level, first-team All-American type of players. You can't win championships with just a bunch of good players. You're going to be better than maybe your overall talent should dictate. I am a believer in college football that the sum can be greater than the parts. It's something I've argued about Bama for years. I've said this for a long time. I felt for years Alabama's been getting players overdrafted constantly. There's been some guys that were legit stars. Everybody knew Derrick Henry was going to be a star. I mean, there's been guys like that. There's been a lot of guys drafted in round 1 that should have been drafted in round 2, round 3, or sometimes even lower. But they get drafted high. Why? Because they played at Bama. And what I always felt about Bama is they'd have their stars, but they just had a lot of good football players. And a lot of those good football players people thought were stars. And really weren't. But even then, they still had those stars at the top. You can go back to those teams that Alabama had won titles, and they had star players. Clemson had star players. Florida State had star players. Why did Auburn win a title in 2010? It's one reason and one reason only. They had the ultimate star in the game in that year in Cam Newton. You have to have star talent. It doesn't have to be elite top 5 overall draft pick star talent, but you need college football stars to win championships. And Notre Dame has that. Their high-level talent is as good as it's been in a long time. Do they have the generational talent like a Jalen Smith, like a Quentin Nelson, like a Will Fuller? That I don't know about. That I'm not sure of. But they have stars, and they have more than they've had in a lot of years. And the only team that, to me, can come close to this team in regard to saying they had more high-level stars, 2012 and 2015. That's it. As far as since 2010, you can go back to like the Brady Quinn era, and they've had some teams like that, but this team has that. You need that. And, Riley Leonard can be a star. Talent-wise can be a star. You've got 2 running backs that have star talent. You have, do you have any receivers? I don't know. But you have a tight end that when healthy is that way. On defense, though, you have more established stars. You have Xavier Watts, who was a unanimous All-American and was the Nagurski Award winner last year. You have Benjamin Morrison, who's established himself as one of the top players in college football. Certainly one of the top defensive backs in all of college football. You have Howard Cross, who's coming back. I don't know that I would put Howard Cross in the star category. I had that debate when I talked about it before. But his production, his level of play is certainly garnered that type of status. And then there's potential breakout stars, and I mentioned them on offense at quarterback and running back. I think there's some guys who could be that at receiver. Billy Schrouth could be that guy at guard. Riley Mills could be that guy at defensive tackle. Does a Josh Burnham, does a Boubacar Traore, does a Drake Bowen, does a Jalen Sneed, does Kingston Villamasa, do one of those, does Christian Gray, do one of those guys also emerge and become stars? Because a lot of teams that won championships had guys like that kind of broke out and were key members of what they were trying to do. Notre Dame has way more established stars and then potential stars than they've had in a long time. Like some of the best teams they had, like 2012, I mean, you had your stars, right? You had Zach Martin, you had Tyler Eifert, you had Stephon Tuitt, Lewis Nix, Manti. After that, was there anybody else that you looked at and said, that guy might be a star? No, there's a lot of good football players. Theo Riddick was a good football player, not a star. TJ Jones, good football player, not a star. Capron Lewis Moore, really quality football player, not a star. Kavari Russell maybe could have been in that conversation, but there just wasn't a lot of that where this team has that top-level talent, but a lot of other potential players that could be on the verge of becoming that type of player. And the same is true in 2015 with that team. So the talent at the top is there. There's a second aspect to talent, however, and this is what has often separated Notre Dame from the top teams. You go back and look at 2022 and 2023. I'd contend that if you take the 5 best players in Notre Dame and stack them up against the 5 best players against Ohio State, it's very close. I felt that about 2015 team for sure, the 2017 team, the 2018 team, and the 2012 team for sure. And I'll take the 2011 team of Tyler Eifert, Michael Floyd, Zach Martin, Manti Te'o, and Harrison Smith and stack that up against anybody's 5 best players. The difference, however, is Ohio State, obviously the quarterback was a difference. But when you look at Ohio State, when you get down to players 8, 9, 10, 11, 15, 20 starters, they were always much better than where Notre Dame was in those same areas. I think Notre Dame has still got the star power, but the depth of talent is different on this team than it has been in a long time. And I think that's a big difference in the past, because it's not just, oh, shoot, if Howard Cross isn't this, right? So like one of the questions that Brandon Rouse had says, why not Cross? I think Cross is a very good football player. I don't think he's a star takeover games type of guy like Stephon Tuitt was, like Sheldon Day was in 2015. And I'm not going to compare him to like the Aaron Donalds. That's different. Those guys were just super freaky generational guys. I just mean, looking at the best players, an elite guy like Howard Cross, if he was a star, has more than 7 tackles for loss and 2 sacks with the way that he plays, and half of that production came against Duke. He's a very good football player. Is he a takeover games week after week type of you have to game plan around him or you're in trouble kind of guy? I don't think so. But here's the thing. They don't necessarily need him to be, because he's not a solo star. He's not a solo standout. He's got Riley Mills as his sidekick, right? He's got Jason Onye and Gabriel Rubio eventually, and Donovan Heinisch and different players coming in with him behind him. So you don't need to rely on Howard as much this year as you did last year, where last year if Howard just kind of played okay and Riley just kind of played okay, your defense suffered mightily. I don't think that's going to be the case this year. You're going to be more talented at defensive end. We got to see if the production matches. You're going to be more talented. You're going to be more talented at Viper now that Boubacar Traore is into the mix. You're going to be more talented at linebacker even than you were last year. Now, will you be as experienced? Will you produce as much? Will you be as assignment correct? All very fair questions, but the talent's there. Notre Dame is right now, Armel Mukam is battling to be your 5th defensive tackle. When Gabriel Rubio comes back, Armel is going to be battling to be your 6th defensive tackle. The last time that Notre Dame made the college football playoff in 2020, and you could go back to both times. You could go back to 2018 as well. There is no doubt that Armel Mukam is in the 2 deep. No doubt. Now he's battling to be in the 3 deep. That's how talented Notre Dame is. There's no doubt that guys right now that we're looking at that probably aren't going to play would have been 2 deep players on the last 2 playoff teams. And there's guys that are backups now that would have been starters on the 2020 team in the secondary. We look at cornerback, and right now we're like, I don't know if Christian Gray is going to beat out Jaden Mickey. Here's the reality. Either one of them would have started opposite of Nick McLeod in 2020. Both of them would have started opposite Nick McLeod. And so that's it's a much deeper team in regard to talent. There's talent at the top, the stars, and then what's your depth of talent. And the one thing that Ohio State, Michigan in recent seasons, say whatever you want to say about the cheating, but the NFL draft clearly bought into Michigan's talent because they had a bunch of guys picked this last year. Georgia, Alabama, teams like that consistently. Back when USC was winning a ton under Pete Carroll, they always had a ton of guys drafted. Why? Because it wasn't just your top 4 or 5 stars. They had NFL football players throughout their roster. They would have backups get drafted. Notre Dame used to have backups get drafted. Go look at the Lou Holtz era. They had backup DBs, guys that started very few games, were kind of sidekick type DBs getting drafted in the 3rd, 4th, and 5th round when Lou Holtz was the head coach of Notre Dame. That's how loaded they were. That's how loaded they were back then. And Notre Dame is not quite there yet, but they're getting really close to that at a lot of positions. There's a couple you could argue that they are. but they're much deeper than they've been in a lot of years. And that's important because I believe they have star power, but do they have the generational talent that some championship teams have had and may have this year? Do they have a quarterback? Riley Leonard's going to be, I think, the best quarterback Notre Dame's had in several years. But can he elevate a team the way that Deshaun Watson did, the way that Jameis Winston did, Cam Newton did? I'm not asking him to be those players, but be an elevator to where you're just so much better because he's your quarterback. We're going to find that out. I don't know that Notre Dame has a ton of that, especially on offense, but they have guys that could be stars, the next level of star. The one way to still be really, really, really good with that is that you've got, your top 5 may be slightly better than our top 5, but our 6 through 20 dominates your 6 through 20. That's how you win football games. That's how you compete for a championship. And so that's why, and that's the number 2 thing for me. You could argue that's number 1, but I still feel it's what I've said before. You guys know what I'm going to say here. I hate the expression that's the Jimmys and Joes, not the X's and O's. I hate that. We have seen plenty of teams with loads of talent not be very good at football. Why? Because those Jimmys and Joes need to be put on the right path to maximizing their talent, and that's where coaching starts. So the coaching has to be the foundation, and then the talent has to get built on top of that. That's how you win. And that's why Nick Saban won at Alabama. Yes, he had talent, but there's been teams with talent, teams that he beat that had more talent, in my opinion, than he had, and teams that beat him that had less talent than he had because they had really, really good coaching. What could Ohio State do in 2014 against Bama that maybe a lot of other teams couldn't do? Yeah, they could match them talent for talent. But what else could that 2014 team do? They could coach with them, with Urban Meyer and Tom Herman and Chris Ash and guys like that. They could coach with them as well. And that's a big part of it. So you need the foundation of the strong coaching. I think they have that at the coordinator level, certainly, but also the talent, this top level talent, and then the depth of talent is important. Now, more specific, both sides of the ball. Another reason for optimism. Won't spend a ton of time here because it's obvious. We've talked a lot about the individual players, but you look at it and say the defense, right? The defense is, I've said this a million times. I don't believe defense wins championships anymore the way it used to, but I have always said defense gets you to the show. Unless you've got a 2019 LSU offense, defense gets you to the show. Defense can get you to the semis. You want to win a championship, you better have an offense. But defense is going to take you a very long way. And this defense is what, to me, can determine if you're going to be able to avoid upsets. If you're a team that relies on outscoring people, if your offense has any kind of off performance, you're going to get beat more often than not against good teams. Defense is what helps you avoid slumps if you have an elite defense. It's not the end-all be-all, as we saw last year, but when you have a top-level defense, that gives you a great chance to be a very good football team. And I do believe this Notre Dame defense has a chance to be that. Little bit of turnover this offseason, not something that should impact the team a whole lot. You obviously lost Chris O'Leary. Mike Mickens takes over the entire secondary. You've got Max Bulla now as a full-time coach. Al Golden is still here. Al Washington is still here. A lot of those guys are now going into year 3, right? Mike Mickens is going into year 5. So 20, 21, 22, 23, 24. Year 5 for Mike Mickens. Max Bulla is going into year 2 at Notre Dame. So Marty Biagi's helping out. He's going into year 2. And we saw what kind of jump year 2 was for a lot of coaches last year. We saw what kind of year 2 jump we saw even from Mike Mickens and what we saw from him in 2020 compared to 2021, where the secondary got a lot better in 2021 compared to where it was in 2020. Not completely there yet. And then obviously going into year 3, it took an even bigger jump than it did before. So you've got that continuity on defense, coaching wise. You've got star power coming back on defense on all levels, right? I mean, you've got the defensive lineman. I look at cornerback as kind of level 2 to a varying degree. A lot of people count it level 3. That's fine. It's not something that I would say that you're wrong. I just look at it differently. The way that Notre Dame plays, I look at it differently because they do so much man. You've got Benjamin Morrison there. And then, of course, you've got your star at safety and Xavier Watts. You've got a lot of experience coming back at very important positions. Another thing, you guys, there's certain things I say a lot. And the reason I say those things a lot is because they're important. They never change. There's something that is always true, in my opinion, in college football. If you're going to be a team that unless you have a 2019 LSU type of team on offense, if you want to be a championship contender, you've got to be great right up the middle on defense. D tackle, inside backer, safety. Well, you've got a 6th-year senior coming back at nose tackle and a 5th-year senior coming back at D tackle that are multi-year starters. You've got a will linebacker that's going into his 6th year that's been a 3-year starter. And you've got an All-American safety coming back, and he's now joined by a 5th-year senior that's had over 2,000 snaps in football the last 2 years at Northwestern. I believe I'm correct on that. It's not, I think it might be the last 3 years. As soon as I said that, I was like, wait a minute, that's a lot of snaps. Is that what his number was? I know he had over 2,000 the last 3 years, but maybe it was the last 2 years because I know he had 853 last. I'm talking about Rod Hurd. He had 853. It's the last 3 years. He's had over 2,000 the last 3 years. I knew that didn't make a lot of sense. But this is a kid that had 853 snaps in the Big Ten last year, 745 snaps in the Big Ten the year before that, and 468 snaps year before that. He's got 2,270 career snaps, and he is now the sidekick to Xavier Watts at that position. So you've got a lot of experience right up the middle, and then also you mix in – now Jason Onye is a senior. He's got, now more time in that. Donovan Heinisch is now a junior. They're both older. You've got Don Schuler, Drake Bowen are the sort of that young talent, but you're not asking your sophomores to be the guy in a way that you have in the past because, yes, Drake Bowen has to do a lot. So does Kingston Vilama-Asa. So will Jalen Sneed. But they're going to have that 6th-year senior leadership and those tackles right in front of them fill a lot of that void. On the edge, on the perimeter, you got a 5th-year senior and a 6th-year senior at your 2 edge positions on defense. You've got a junior as your boundary corner who's now a 3-year starter. So you've got a 6th-year senior at nickel mixed in with a lot of young talent. And that's where I start to have a lot of optimism because it's this really weird, they're either a 5th or 6th-year senior or a freshman or a sophomore. There's like very few juniors that are like, you've got Burnham and you've got Morrison and you've got Jalen Sneed, but outside of that, a lot of your depth charts, like Mickey, a lot of your depth charts, 5th or 6th-year guys are freshmen and sophomores in a lot of places, and so there is that unique blend. But you have so much experience that your defense should be in position to continue building on what it established last year. And that's kind of where I look at it and start to get a little bit excited about what this football team can be because the defense has a chance to be so special. I think that's another reason that I'm optimistic that this team has a chance to be a championship contender in 2024. Reason number 4, offensive weapons. This is one that's probably the most debatable amongst the fans. And it's understandable because there's a lot of fans that, especially folks that are my age and older or slightly younger, sort of in this generation of fans that got a taste of that greatness that we saw under Lou Holtz and older fans even more so, like they saw it under Divine and Era and all that type of stuff. But like for my age, I was 10 when Notre Dame won the last national title. And I remember it. I still remember watching the USC game that year at my friend Jamison Jennings' house. They had one of those big satellite TVs with a big old huge satellite in the backyard, watching Tony Rice and Rocket and Stan Smagala with the pick six and all that type of stuff. I remember that. Very memorable time in my life. As a Notre Dame fan. It was when I kind of first became a Notre Dame fan. But it's been kind of bitter since then. You had a couple, great years under Coach Holtz. 89 was a great team. 93 was a great team. But by and large, it's been a lot of disappointment. And especially on the offensive side of the ball as of late. And the receiver position has been incredibly disappointing as of late. Notre Dame has not had a receiver drafted since 2020. They have not had a single wide receiver drafted since 2020. They haven't had a first-round draft pick at receiver since 2016. We're getting close to a decade since Notre Dame has had a first-round draft pick at receiver. They haven't had a first or second-round draft pick at running back since, I think, Reggie Brooks and Jerome Bettis, I believe, is the last time that Notre Dame has had a running back. They've had a lot of third-round draft picks, but I don't believe – I'm actually going to look that up because I do believe – it is so Audric was a 5th-round pick last year. Kyron was a 5th-round pick. Dex was a 6th-round pick. CJ Prosise was a 3rd-round pick. Theo was a 6th-round pick. Julius Jones, 2004, was the last time that Notre Dame had a 2nd or 1st-round draft pick at running back. Prior to that, you have to go back to, you had some full 1997. You had a fullback in Mark Edwards. Ray Zellers is a fullback in 1992. You got to go back to all the way to 1993. 1993, when Jerome Bettis was taken in the 1st round, as Notre Dame had a 1st-round draft pick at running back, and Reggie Brooks was a 2nd-round pick that year. So, yeah, there's a lot of, you got to show me. Now, I do think there's more optimism amongst fans at running back because we haven't seen the high level, like, oh my gosh, Jerome Bettis, Reggie Brooks, elite game, takeover game, elite running backs. We've seen some really good running backs that have gone on to play in the NFL. So there's a little bit more optimism there. But at receiver, I understand, quarterback, I understand some of the skepticism. And it's not fair and not overly productive. But as fans, we're going to look at things and say, well, because Sam Hartman didn't pan out, and because you may feel a certain way about Jack Cohn, that equals Riley Leonard is not this. Okay, that's not really productive, and those two things have nothing to do with each other, but I understand it. I really do. And it's like, yeah, we've been here before. You guys liked Sam Hartman last year. True, but not like this guy. And as I said before, I had to kind of talk myself into feeling good about Sam Hartman. Riley Leonard's a different deal. We've been praising him as a great player since before we had any clue he's going to be in the portal. But I understand that skepticism. I need to see it in a Notre Dame uniform. Wide receiver, as I mentioned earlier with Chris Mitchell, there's a lot of with Chris Mitchell. Why? Played at Florida International. We're in a chat yesterday, and people were trying to talk down success. Yeah, well, he did it in this Conference USA. Okay. Well, what about when he went on against an SEC team? Well, yeah, but they weren't very good. Okay, but how about the fact that he outperformed, Malik Neighbors and Bryan Thomas against that same defense? Well, yeah, but he only has 6 touchdowns. But there's all this talking down of the transfer receivers by it. Not all. I mean, my guy Tommy Guns is constantly talking. He is to Bo Collins what my man Salty is to Jaden Greathouse, right? Like what Vince was to Cam Hart. He is all on board. So, there's certainly some, and I think there's some optimism, but there's a big chunk that sort of have this, yeah, but I need to see it mentality. And you know what? Honestly, that's fair. That's completely fair. And I don't even have an issue with that. But here's where I'm at on it. Okay. I'm actually excited about this talent because for 2 reasons. It's similar to my overall talent that I talked about at the team. But when I look at this offensive unit, quarterback's a little different because your 2 next best talents are young, unproven players, and Kenny mentioned CJ Carr. When I look at the running back room, you could lose your top 2 running backs and still have 2 very talented, young, but very talented players on the field. As long as you have one of your top 2 studs, you've got a stud. And when you look at receiver, I think Chris Mitchell's got a chance to be a very good football player. I think that, look, we've seen how many highlights have we seen from Notre Dame putting out of Chris Mitchell catching a deep ball on one of the starters? Guys, these are corners that do not give up deep balls. We have 2 years of evidence of them not giving up deep balls, right? But we keep seeing Chris Mitchell running by him. Oh, okay, well, there's the reason for that. No, Bo Collins has looked as good as he looked. Jaden Greathouse continues having a great offseason. Those are reasons to be optimistic, but it's not just that. It's that you don't need Chris Mitchell to be that for your receiver room to still be really good. You don't need Jaden Greathouse to become a breakout star for this receiver room to still be really good. You don't need Bo Collins to tap into his top 100 high school potential for this receiver room to be really good. Now, if they all 3 miss, okay, it's going to be harder, but even then, you have Jordan Faison. You have Jaden Harrison, who's a preseason All-American as a kick returner. You have KK Smith. You have Jaden Thomas, who going into last year, the coaching staff felt was their best receiver. You've got a 5-star freshman in Cam Williams. You've got a talented wide receiver in your freshman class also in Micah Gilbert and Logan Saldate. I mean, the depth of talent is the key to where, as I said in past years, you were always like one or two guys had to be good. If they weren't, you were screwed. That's really where you really have to be. And I don't buy the notion that you have to have a star there. There's a lot of star receivers. Ohio State had the biggest star in college football the last 2 years, and how many championships did they win? How many Big Ten championships did they win? None, right? I mean, heck, Marvin Harrison had never, as a starter, never won a postseason game at Ohio State because they lost to Georgia 2 years ago and lost to Missouri last year. He didn't even play in that game. You look at LSU, Malik Neighbors and Bryan Thomas, best 1-2 punch in all college football last year. What did they win? Nothing. National championship team last year, their best receiver was a tight end, and their second best receiver was Roman Wilson. Not really a star. You know, so I would argue Georgia in 2021 didn't have a star. Brock Bowers was going to be one, but I don't believe he was a star at the time. But here's the thing, I will say this. If you're not going to have a star, you better have a lot of really good players. And that's where I'm coming from with this Notre Dame football team, is you have to be a team that can throw waves of people at defenses, or you better have a star or two. And this Notre Dame football team can throw waves at people. They've got guys running reported 4.3s and 4.4s that are second and third team right now at receiver. That's how talented this group is. Jordan Faison was Notre Dame's best receiver at the end of the season last year. Jordan Faison right now is not a starter at Notre Dame. And not because he played lacrosse, just because that's how loaded they are at that position. Jaden Harrison was his team's leading receiver last year. Not going to be a starter. Might not even be number 2 at that position. Jaden Thomas was Notre Dame's best receiver last year before he got hurt. He's definitely not going to be the number 1 guy on this team, and he may not even start. This team is loaded with talent there. And then, of course, you throw in the fact that they have the talent running back, talent quarterback. They actually have the talent to go out there and be a really, really explosive offense. Now, do they have to put it together? Yes. Am I saying right here that Notre Dame is going to be an elite offense this year? No, sir. No, ma'am, I am not. Am I sitting here saying that there's no doubt in my mind, they're flat out, they're going to go out there, they're going to do this, and this. I'm predicting this, and this. And if you disagree with me, you don't know what you're talking about. No, sir, no, ma'am, I am not. What I'm saying is simply this. This part to me is not arguable. This is the deepest group of offensive skill talent that Notre Dame has had in over 20 years. They may not have a Jeff Samardzija on this roster. They may not have a Will Fuller on this roster, but what they have is a deep group of players that are really talented athletes. And when you have that, the margin for error for you from week to week is significantly better in your advantage. It's significantly smaller. Or actually, I'd say bigger. You have a much bigger margin for error, because if your whole season is wrapped around, we need number 10 to do here what he did at Florida International. Well, what if you have a team that can lock him down? What if he's got a little minor hammy? What if he's just not playing well in that game? You're in trouble. Or, man, we need Jaden Greathouse to be a stud for Notre Dame if they're going to be this team. And if he struggles, they're in trouble. That's been the case for a lot of Notre Dame offenses in recent years. Well, what if they play a team that's got a great nickel? What if he's got a hammy? What if he's not playing well? What if they double team him and took him out of the game? You're in trouble. That's what when teams could take Michael Mayer out of the game, Notre Dame was in trouble. When Kevin Austin had a bad game, Notre Dame was in trouble. You go along the line, down the list of these players. If Chris Mitchell's not playing well, or if he's getting double teamed, all right, that's cool. You've got backups and going. You got Jordan Faison that you can put in a game. You got KK Smith you can put in a game. You can put James Thomas out there. You can put Jane Greathouse out there, right? When you look at, hey, want Jaden Thomas step up. In the past years, if Jaden Thomas didn't step up, completely screwed your boundary depth chart. Now, if he doesn't step up or he gets hurt again, you got Bo Collins. You've got Micah Gilbert. You can put Cam Williams over there. You've got plenty of options that you can go over there. Jaden Greathouse could go over there, and he'll be better positioned to play that this year than he did last year. The point is, if you double team one of those weapons, if your game plan is we got to stop Mitchell Evans, we got to stop Jaden Greathouse, we got to stop Bo Collins, we got to stop Jaden Thomas, we got to stop Chris Mitchell, whoever that may be, the answer is then, okay, but then how do you stop that guy? And then also, how do you do that and stop Riley Leonard or Jeremiah Love or Jadarian Price? Okay, you're going to double team Jaden Greathouse because he's coming off of a 9-catch, 150-yard, 2-touchdown performance against whoever. Okay, cool. Put all your effort into stopping him and Mitchell Evans. How are you going to defend the outside against Chris Mitchell, Bo Collins, Jaden Thomas? How are you going to handle Jeremiah Love, Jadarian Price coming out of the backfield? How are you going to handle Riley Leonard? Right? Like, you can't stop that many players. Just can't. And that's what makes this team, to me, potentially dangerous. Now, they got to prove it. But when you look at those offensive weapons, when you look at that talent, it certainly gets you fired up. Very fired up about how good this team could be. I mean, I made a comment the other day. I mentioned Mitchell Evans is my team MVP for offense, or my offensive MVP. I feel that this team is completely different when Mitchell Evans is in the game compared to when he's not in the game. And I'm someone who is very high on Eli Raridan and Cooper Flanagan, those guys. But immediately as soon as I said that, you had people in the chat talking about Eli Raridan. And I'm kind of like, I'm not going to argue with you. But to this point, that kind of makes the point, right? Like, okay, you lose Mitchell Evans. That sucks. But you've got Eli Raridan that you can bring in. You've got Cooper Flanagan that you can throw in there. There's not a lot of teams that can do that. There's not a lot of teams that can lose this player, and you've got another athlete coming up. And that's what's different about this Notre Dame team. It's the margin for error is much, much wider. And there's speed all over on this offensive team. Now they just got to put it all together. And then my fifth reason why I believe this team is set up to make a run is the schedule. Not the way that some of you think I'm going to go with this one. I'm talking about it from this regard. I think the schedule is challenging, but not unnecessarily so. I think that this schedule has a nice mix of road and away. You're never home too much. You're never on the road too much. You don't have the back-to-back gauntlet that you've had in other seasons as well. And that is a very important piece to this. I don't believe that this year's schedule is inferior to last year's schedule when you look at it from a 1-12 standpoint. I don't. Is there anybody on this year's schedule as good as Ohio State? Maybe not. I think it's at least debatable. But I can understand why people don't think Florida State is. I would disagree with that. But I think top to bottom, this schedule is every bit as good, if not better, than last year's schedule. It's debatable, but it's at least in the conversation. But here's what and that's just looking at the 12 teams. Here's what made last year's schedule more challenging, however. Not opponent-wise, not harder. I actually think opponent-wise, this year's schedule is a little bit more challenging than last year's schedule. But here's the difference. Last year, 5 out of 6 games in consecutive order were NC State on the road, Ohio State, at Duke, at Louisville, home against USC. You had that one little Central Michigan thing in there, no buys in there, and then that 4-game stretch of Ohio State, Duke, Louisville, USC, 2 of those games on the road, all 4 of those games at night. So while we could debate the 12 versus 12 discussion, and I'm going to say it's not as easy as some of you think it is. My guy Ant VR, love him as a poster. He was pushing back on the notion of the schedule. He thinks the schedule's a lot softer. I think it's not softer. We can have that back and forth, and it's like there's points to be made on both sides. What is not debatable is when you take it away from the 1-12 and you look at the way it was put together, last year's schedule was much harder to manage through than this year's schedule is, in my opinion. Last year's schedule also did not have a bye until October 21st. You went and played in Ireland. You played at NC State, at Duke, at Louisville. You played Ohio State at home, USC at home before you had your bye week. It's not the case this year. It's a little different this year. This year, you start the season off on the road, not quite as far as Ireland, but it's far. 3 of your next 4 games are at home. Then you have a bye, and your only road game after A&M is a bus ride to West Lafayette, Indiana. You don't hop on a plane again until the middle of October, almost 2 months. Notre Dame won't have to get on a plane to go play a football game. I guess they could maybe charter a 20-minute flight to West Lafayette, but I would imagine that's going to be a bus ride, right? And so that's a much, much more manageable slate. Then you get into the late part of the season. You have that first bye in October, first week of October. Then you play 3 games. 2 of them are away from home, right? So that's one of your only 2 back-to-back road games at Georgia Tech and then Navy in East Rutherford. Neither of those are, a lot of us that flown out of South Bend know that Atlanta flight's not a brutal flight, but it's still a road game. And then you've got to go to Jersey to play Navy, but then there's another bye. And then you're home for 2 more weeks before you finish the season in New York and then out in LA. So it's a challenging schedule because there's quality opponents. It's a challenging schedule from the standpoint of you've got some back-to-back road game situations. You've got to go play some tough teams. You've got to go on the 2 of your 3 best opponents arguably are road games, because you could argue that your 3 top opponents are Texas A&M, Florida State, and USC. Some may argue Louisville. I'm fine with that. I think certainly Louisville is going to be a challenging team this year. Let's just go with the 3 ranked teams. You play 3 teams that are preseason top 25. 2 of them are on the road. But here's the thing. One's at the very beginning of the year. One's at the very end of the year. Right? And so as Kenny Moore said, the schedule's not soft, but it's more manageable. That's it. That's what I'm getting to, Kenny. It's set up much better. The buys are in a much better place. The where teams are placed, you don't really have a strong back-to-back situation. Like it's A&M or Northern Illinois or Purdue or Miami and Louisville and Stanford and Georgia Tech and Navy and Florida State and Virginia Army USC. Which one of those back-to-back games makes you say, boy, I don't know how you survive those 2 back-to-back games? There's a chance that the toughest back-to-back games Notre Dame plays all year is either Army and USC or Florida State and Virginia. Much more manageable. And that is something to me that I look at this football team, and the reason that matters now more than it ever has is because in order to win a championship, you've got to then play 4 more games at the end of the year. 3 of them most likely are going to be away from home. And you're going to need to be fresh and not have to go through the typical gauntlet that's harder to recover from that Notre Dame has gone through in the past. And that's the difference between this schedule and others that maybe didn't always put Notre Dame in the best position to be successful. My pushback on teams that want to schedule soft is don't schedule softer, schedule smarter, right? And I think Notre Dame with this schedule has done that. The only thing that I would somewhat nitpick, and I've said this before, is I would prefer that they flipped Northern Illinois and Texas A&M. That's the only difference that I would want to make. And I think there's probably some coaches at Notre Dame that would disagree with me on that, because they don't want A&M to see anything that they're doing, just like A&M doesn't want Notre Dame to see anything they're doing. They may actually say, hey, look, let's just get this game over with. We get the extra week to prepare for it. Then we can go and get into our get-right schedule. Okay, cool. Debatable, right? And not wrong. I just personally, my personal preference is I kind of like to have a game at the very beginning that's kind of like, okay, it's a let's get it going type of thing for me. That's where I'm at with the schedule. So I think reason number 5 for me that this Notre Dame team has a chance to go on a title run is schedule. So to recap, the coordinators are a reason to be excited. The talent at the top plus the depth of talent. is a reason to be excited. The defense should once again be an outstanding group. Number 4, your offensive weapons are as deep as you've been in a very, very long time at every single skill position. And then number 5, your schedule is challenging enough to be prepared for the postseason, but not so challenging that you're worn out for the postseason, or you've got some really tough spots where you're going to stub your toe unnecessarily because of the gauntlet you have to go through. You don't have that this year. And I think that's something that's very important when you look at the makeup of this Notre Dame football team. So those are my reasons to be optimistic. Next, I'm going to talk about potential stumbling blocks. That'll be the final segment of today's show. Before we get there, folks, hit that like, hit that subscribe, hit that notification bell, share this podcast, give us a 5-star review. And if you've not done so, join the message board at boards.oshbreakdown.com. Great community, intel. I'm going to completely revamp over the next year or two our content production, which is going to focus on more unique content just for the board that I'm going to be doing, especially post-game stuff with some videos and different things like that. You are not going to want to miss out on that at all. So you definitely want to check that out and see what we have to offer. Boards.oshbreakdown.com. Give it a look. I think you guys are going to love what we're doing over there.